That barn is a community asset, Mr. Hayes. And since you can't maintain it to our standards, the association will be assuming ownership under Bylaw 17, Section C, for the betterment of the neighborhood. The words slid out of Karen Thompson's mouth like grease, slick and condescending, each syllable a tiny assertion of a power she had no right to. She stood on my lawn, a good 10 feet inside my property line, a thick woman in a floral blouse that strained at the seams, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a shield. Her face was a mask of smug righteousness, her eyes scanning the weathered but solid oak of my barn, the barn my father and I had built with our own hands 30 years ago, as if she were mentally calculating how much it would cost to slap a coat of beige paint on it and turn it into a community clubhouse. The flimsy piece of paper she just handed me, a formal-looking, final notice of asset forfeiture, felt like a joke, but the look in her eyes was anything but. This wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war. She was the president of a homeowners association that had sprung up around my 5-acre plot like a manicured fungus, and she was trying to steal my history, my property, my father's legacy, one piece of paper at a time. The sheer audacity of it left a metallic taste in my mouth, the cold, sharp tang of injustice. This is the kind of nightmare that can happen to anyone, anywhere, when a little bit of power falls into the wrong hands. If you've ever had your own HOA horror story, or just believe in the right to be left alone on your own property, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to deal with a Karen of your own. Your support means the world, and trust me, you're going to want to see how this one ends. Now let me take you back to how this all started, because this wasn't her first shot across the bow. It was just the one that finally made me decide to shoot back. It began subtly, as these things often do. I'm a retired Army combat engineer, a man who spent 25 years building and demolishing things in far less friendly places than suburban America. When I retired, all I wanted was peace. I came back to the house my parents left me, a solid brick ranch on 5 acres of land that had been in my family since my grandfather bought it after the Second World War. The centerpiece of the property, set back a good 200 yards from the house, was the barn. It wasn't just a structure, it was a monument to my father. We laid the foundation the summer I turned 16. He taught me how to measure twice and cut once, how to frame a wall, how to set a truss. After he passed, finishing it became my mission whenever I was home on leave. It was my sanctuary, filled with his old tools, the smell of sawdust and engine oil, and the quiet echo of his laughter. For years, my property was an island of green surrounded by fields. Then about a decade ago, a developer bought the surrounding farmland. The Whispering Pines Horse subdivision was born, a sprawling maze of identical beige houses with identical manicured lawns. I didn't mind. I kept to myself, and they, for the most part, kept to theirs. The homeowners association was formed, but my property was explicitly grandfathered out of their jurisdiction in the initial county filings, a fact I had triple-checked with my lawyer at the time. I was an independent territory, a sovereign nation of 5 acres. At least that's what the paperwork said. But paperwork, I would soon learn, means very little to someone who believes rules are for other people. Karen Thompson was elected HOA president 3 years ago on a platform of beautification and compliance. Her reign began with whispers, then memos, then fines. Mailboxes had to be a specific model. Lawn grass couldn't exceed 3 inches. Holiday decorations had to be removed by January 5th. I watched it all from my island, a bemused observer. Then the first official letter addressed to me arrived. It was a courtesy notice about the unapproved agricultural structure on my land, my barn. It suggested I submit an architectural plan and a request for a variance, as a good neighbor. I wrote back a polite, firm letter with a copy of my deed and the county filing that proved their HOA had no authority over my land. I assumed that would be the end of it. It was in fact just the beginning. The courtesy notices became violation warnings. The warnings became fines, starting at $50 and escalating with each letter. The charge was always the same: failure to adhere to community aesthetic standards. They were fining me for the color of my barn's weathered wood, for the classic cupola on its roof, for its very existence. It was absurd, like getting a ticket from the French government because you don't have a gargoyle on your house in Ohio. I ignored them. What could they do? I wasn't a member. I hadn't signed their covenants. They had no legal standing, but Karen was a special breed of antagonist. She didn't operate on logic or law. She operated on pure, unadulterated entitlement. She saw my barn not as a piece of my private property, but as a flaw in her perfect beige world. It was a rogue element she couldn't control, and that drove her mad. She started talking to my newer neighbors, spinning tales about how my dilapidated barn was dragging down their property values. She portrayed me as a stubborn old recluse who refused to cooperate for the good of the community. She was building a narrative, painting me as the villain before she ever launched her main assault. I'd see her from my porch, pointing at my property while talking to other residents on her daily power walks, her clipboard always in hand. The social pressure was her first real weapon. A few neighbors started giving me cold looks. One guy, a new transplant from some city, actually had the gall to tell me I should just paint the barn to keep the peace. Keep the peace? I was the one being besieged. This slow, simmering conflict, this war of attrition waged through letters and gossip, went on for 2 years. I held my ground, secure in my legal position. I never imagined she would have the audacity to escalate from paper threats to an outright attempt at seizure. That final notice of asset forfeiture was a leap into a new dimension of crazy. The bylaw she cited, 17C, was a piece of bureaucratic fiction she'd likely drafted herself. Something about the association's right to remediate and assume control of any property, member or non-member, that poses a persistent and uncorrected blight upon the community. It was legally unenforceable, pure fantasy, but it was printed on official-looking HOA letterhead. It was a bluff, but a dangerous one. It was designed to intimidate, to scare someone into submission. And standing there on my lawn, watching her smug face, I knew she believed her own lie. She believed that if she said it was the rule, it became the rule. And that was the moment the quiet, peaceful retirement I had planned for myself officially ended. The combat engineer in me, the part that understands that you don't let an enemy establish a foothold on your ground, woke up. The war was no longer cold. She had brought it to my front door. My first move wasn't to scream or to call a lawyer. It was to retreat, consolidate, and plan. 25 years in the military teaches you that the calmest man in the room is usually the most dangerous. I went back inside, laid the notice on my kitchen table, and made a pot of coffee, the strong, black kind that could strip paint. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. But inside, a cold fire was burning. She had crossed a line that wasn't just on a property plat. It was a line of fundamental respect. She wanted my barn. She wanted to take my father's memory and paint it beige. Over my dead body, I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. At the top of the page, I wrote, Operation Karen. My first heading was Documentation. I went to my office and retrieved the file I'd already started. It contained every piece of correspondence she'd ever sent me. The polite letters, the escalating fines, my polite responses, the certified mail receipts. I added the new forfeiture notice to the top of the pile. Then I went outside with a digital camera. I took hundreds of photos of the barn from every angle. I photographed the solid foundation, the straight roof line, the tight joinery. It was weathered, yes, but it was as solid as a fortress. It was a testament to old-world craftsmanship, the antithesis of the particle board and staple construction of the houses in her kingdom. I then photographed the property lines, the survey stakes I'd had refreshed just 5 years prior. I took wide shots showing the immense distance between my barn and any of the HOA properties. The idea that it was an aesthetic blight on them was laughable. Most of them couldn't even see it clearly without binoculars. This wasn't about property values, it was about her ego. I spent the rest of the day creating what the Army calls a war binder. Every document was placed in a plastic sleeve. Every photo was printed, dated, and captioned. I created a timeline of events from the first courtesy notice to today's declaration of war. I logged every conversation, every sideways glance, every pointed comment from a neighbor she had poisoned against me. When I was done, I had a 3-inch thick binder that told a crystal clear story of targeted harassment. My next step was reconnaissance. I needed to understand the enemy and the battlefield. The battlefield was the HOA's own bylaws and covenants. I'd read them before, but now I read them like a demolitions expert studying a blueprint, looking for the load-bearing walls, the weak points, the flaws in the design. I spent hours online, downloading the official versions from the county registrar's office. I highlighted every section that defined the HOA's powers, its jurisdiction, and the responsibilities of its board members. I found the section that detailed my property's exemption. It was clear and unambiguous, but then I found something else, buried deep in the amendments. An amendment passed a year after Karen took power, voted on at a poorly attended meeting in the middle of a workday. It was a vaguely worded addition that attempted to grant the board emergency powers to address external threats to community value. It was garbage, legally speaking. It couldn't supersede a recorded property deed. But it was the flimsy legal pretext she was using. She had laid the groundwork for this attack long ago. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on my back porch looking at the dark silhouette of the barn against the stars. I thought about my dad, his calloused hands showing me how to swing a hammer. "You build things to last, son," he'd told me, "not just for yourself, but for the folks who come after you." Karen Thompson wasn't just trying to take a building. She was trying to erase a foundation. And I realized this fight was no longer just about me or my barn. It was about the principle. You don't let a bully win, not because of what they'll take from you, but because of who they'll go after next. The next morning, I decided it was time to move from defense to offense. My war binder was my shield. Now I needed a sword. And I had a feeling the best place to find one was hidden somewhere in Karen Thompson's own kingdom of beige. She had built her power base on the idea of rules and standards. It was time to see just how closely she followed them herself. My investigation into Karen Thompson started not with a bang, but with a quiet conversation over a fence. My direct neighbor to the east was an older woman named Martha, a widow who had lived in her house since the subdivision was built. She mostly kept to herself, tending a small but immaculate garden of roses. I'd seen Karen's car parked in front of her house several times, and I'd noticed Martha had recently replaced her perfectly functional, cream-colored mailbox with the HOA-approved black one. I found her pruning her roses one afternoon and struck up a conversation. I kept it casual, asking about her flowers. After a few minutes of pleasantries, I gently steered the conversation. "Looks like you finally caved on the mailbox," I said with a small smile. Her face tightened. The clippers in her hand stilled. "I got tired of the letters," she said, her voice low. "And the fines. $100 a month. For a mailbox." She shook her head, a flicker of anger in her tired eyes. "It's not about the money, you know. It's the arrogance." I nodded, letting the silence hang. "She's coming after my barn now," I said quietly. Martha's eyes widened. "The barn? But that's been there forever. It's not even part of this place." "She seems to think it is," I replied, watching her reaction. "She handed me a notice saying the HOA is going to take ownership of it." Martha let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. "That woman is drunk on power. She thinks she's a queen. She holds these board meetings, and it's not a discussion. It's a coronation. She tells everyone what the new rules are, and her little friends on the board, they all just nod." This was the opening I needed. "The board," I said. "What do you know about how they handle the money? All those fines must add up." Martha leaned closer, lowering her voice even more. "Nobody knows. The financial reports are a joke. They're just a single page with a few numbers. Landscaping, $50,000. Administrative costs, $20. 000. No details, no invoices. People have asked. Karen just says it's too complex for regular homeowners to understand, and that the board has it under control." My internal alarms went off. Opaque financials are the calling card of a poorly run and often corrupt organization. "What about the pool?" I asked. The new community pool was Karen's magnum opus. It had been completed last summer, A massive resort-style affair with a waterfall feature and expensive-looking landscaping. It was her symbol of progress, the jewel in her HOA crown. "Oh, the pool," Martha scoffed. "Her legacy project. Cost a fortune. Our dues went up 30% to pay for it. She said it would catapult our community into the premier tier." Catapult them into debt, more like. I thanked Martha for her time and went back to my house, her words echoing in my mind. Too complex for regular homeowners to understand. That was the kind of condescending phrase a person uses when they have something to hide. My next stop was the county's public records website. It was a clunky, archaic system, but I knew my way around it from past property research. I started with the HOA's corporate filings. Everything seemed in order on the surface. Karen Thompson, president. Two of her known cronies, Janice and Bob, as treasurer and secretary. But then I started pulling the financial statements they were required to file annually. Just as Martha said, they were laughably vague. Huge, round numbers with no itemization. It was the kind of accounting that would make a first-year business student weep. This wasn't transparency, it was obfuscation. I decided to dig into Karen herself. I pulled the property records for her house. Standard mortgage, nothing unusual. But then I ran a search for any other properties or businesses under her name. Bingo. Thompson's Premier Landscaping, LLC, a company she had formed 2 years ago, right after becoming HOA president. My heart started beating a little faster. I went back to the HOA's vague financial statements. Landscaping, $50,000. I cross-referenced the start date of her company with the HOA's budget increases. The big jump in landscaping fees happened exactly 3 months after she registered her LLC. It was a classic case of self-dealing, a blatant conflict of interest. She was awarding a massive, no-bid contract to herself. I printed everything: the LLC registration, the HOA budgets, the timeline. It was a damning piece of evidence, but it felt incomplete. It was dirty for sure, but I needed something bigger, something undeniable, something that would blow her entire empire apart. My eyes kept drifting back to the line item for the pool. Pool construction, $250,000. $250,000. For that kind of money, there should be a mountain of paperwork, contracts, bids, and most importantly, permits. Every single phase of a project that large, excavation, structural, plumbing, electrical, requires a permit from the county. It's a matter of public safety. On a hunch, a wild long-shot idea, I navigated to the county's permit database. I typed in the address of the community clubhouse and pool. The system churned for a moment and then returned the results. My breath caught in my throat. There were a few minor permits listed, one for a fence repair 5 years ago, one for a sign installation. But for the period of the pool's construction last year, nothing, not a single permit, no application for excavation, no plumbing permit, no electrical permit, no certificate of occupancy. I tried searching by the HOA's name. Nothing. I searched by the lot number. Nothing. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitor illuminating my stunned face. It was impossible. You can't build a doghouse in this county without a permit, let alone a $250,000 commercial-grade swimming pool. The liability, the insurance nightmare, the sheer brazen illegality of it was staggering. Karen Thompson, the woman obsessed with rules, the queen of compliance, the enforcer of aesthetic standards, had built her shining monument on a foundation of pure lawlessness. She hadn't just bent the rules, she'd driven a bulldozer straight through the entire building code. This was it. This was the sword. And I was going to use it to cut the legs out from under her throne. The screen of my monitor glowed with the absence of information. No permits. It was a void, a digital black hole where a mountain of public records should have been. For a moment, I doubted myself. Maybe I was searching wrong. Maybe the county's website was faulty. I spent another hour trying every conceivable search parameter, date ranges, contractor names, though I didn't have any, parcel numbers of adjacent lots. The result was always the same, a deafening, damning silence. The Whispering Pines Community Pool, Karen Thompson's crowning achievement, did not legally exist. I leaned back, the old wood of my office chair creaking in protest. The implications began to cascade in my mind. Without permits, there were no inspections. Without inspections, there was no way to know if the wiring for the pumps and lights was safe. Was the rebar in the concrete shell up to code? Was the plumbing system properly sealed to prevent leaks and contamination? Was the entire structure even stable? And then the biggest, most terrifying thought, insurance. No insurance company on earth would knowingly cover an unpermitted, uninspected commercial pool. If a child were to get hurt, or worse, the HOA's liability insurance would be null and void. The liability would then fall directly onto the homeowners themselves. Every single person in that subdivision was personally exposed to a potentially ruinous lawsuit, all because Karen wanted her shiny pool and couldn't be bothered with the law. She had put her entire community at catastrophic risk. The hypocrisy was so profound, it was almost beautiful in its symmetry. This woman, who was trying to seize my barn for being an aesthetic blight, had created a genuine, potentially lethal public hazard. My weathered but solid barn, built to last for a century, versus her gleaming illegal death trap. The irony was thick enough to choke on. My path forward was now illuminated with blinding clarity. I couldn't just drop this bomb in an email or at a shouting match in the street. This kind of weapon had to be deployed with precision at the moment of maximum impact. I needed a formal setting. I needed witnesses. I needed her to climb as high as she possibly could on her mountain of arrogance. Right before I kicked the whole thing out from under her, I needed a lawyer. The next morning I made a call. A buddy from my old unit, a guy who traded his sapper's kit for a briefcase, had recommended a lawyer in the city. His name was Ben Carter. "He's a bulldog," my friend had said, "and he's a vet. He gets it." Ben's office was in a sleek downtown high-rise, a world away from my quiet acreage. But the man himself was all business. He was younger than me, maybe early 40s, with a sharp suit and a gaze that missed nothing. He listened without interruption as I laid out the entire story, starting with the first letter and ending with the forfeiture notice. I handed him my war binder. He spent a full 20 minutes flipping through it, his expression unreadable. He examined the photos, read the correspondence, and traced the timeline. "This is meticulous, Mr. Hayes," he said, finally looking up. "You've done 90% of my work for me." "I believe in being prepared," I said. "Now for the offensive part." I told him what I had found, or rather, what I hadn't found, in the county permit database. As I spoke, a slow grin spread across Ben's face. It was not a friendly grin. It was the grin of a predator that has just spotted a fatal weakness in its prey. He turned to his own computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He navigated the same county websites I had, his professional access likely giving him a deeper view. After 5 minutes of searching, he swiveled the monitor toward me. "Confirmed," he said, the grin widening. "Not a single permit filed for new construction at that address. Not for a shed, let alone a pool. The electrical contractor they must have used would have had to work completely off the books. Same for the plumbers. This isn't just an HOA violation, Mr. Hayes. This is professional misconduct, likely insurance fraud, and a massive public safety issue. The county will have an absolute field day with this." The feeling of vindication was immense. "So what's our play here?" I asked. "We could send a letter to the board in the county right now," Ben said, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. "The county would shut them down in a heartbeat. Karen would be disgraced. You'd win." He paused. "But that's a tactical victory. I think we can go for a strategic one." He explained his idea. Karen had called for a special hearing to enforce the forfeiture of my barn. The notice had set the date for 2 weeks from now. "We don't show our hand," Ben said. "Not yet. We let her have her hearing. We let her stand up in front of the whole community and make her case. We let her publicly try to hang you. She'll bring her own lawyer, who is probably some small-time guy who just cashes the HOA's checks and hasn't done any real due diligence. She will feel completely invincible." The plan was simple and brutal. We would attend the hearing. I would give a calm, rational defense regarding my barn, presenting my deed and the grandfather clause purely for the record. We would let her and her board vote. And then, at the moment of her supposed triumph, just as she moved to finalize the seizure of my property, Ben would take the floor. He wouldn't argue about the barn. He would simply ask a few pointed questions about the pool, about the permits, about the insurance, about the liability of every single homeowner in the room. "We're not just going to save your barn," Ben said, his eyes glinting. "We're going to give the entire community the ammunition they need to remove her and her entire corrupt board. We're going to let her build her own gallows, and then we're going to hand her the rope." It was perfect. It was a classic counter-ambush. She thought she was the hunter, leading me into a trap of her own making. She had no idea she was the one walking into the kill zone. We spent the next hour drafting my formal response to the hearing notice and preparing my brief, fact-based presentation. It was all a smokescreen, a piece of theater designed to keep her focused on the barn, her obsession, while the real threat gathered in the shadows. I left Ben's office feeling 10 feet tall. The cold anger inside me had been forged into a sharp, clear purpose. The next 2 weeks were going to be an exercise in discipline, in holding my tongue and playing the part of the cornered victim. But I knew what was coming. A storm was coming for Karen Thompson, and she was sunbathing right in the middle of the beach. With the legal strategy set, the next phase of the operation was to build a ground force. Ben's plan was devastating, but its full impact would depend on the reaction of the other homeowners. I needed to turn a room of passive observers into an angry mob. I needed allies. My first stop was back at Martha's rose garden. I found her watering her plants, the new black mailbox standing like a little tombstone at the end of her driveway. I told her about the upcoming hearing. "She's actually going through with it?" she asked, her face a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "She's holding a public meeting to vote on seizing my barn." "I'll be there," she said immediately, her voice firm. "What she's doing is wrong." "I appreciate that, Martha, but I need more than just support. I have a plan, but for it to work, I need people to be prepared for what's coming." I made a decision. I could trust her. I explained the basics of what I'd found, without going into the legal nitty-gritty. I told her about Karen's landscaping company and the self-dealing contracts. Martha's eyes, already angry, hardened into points of steel. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew something was wrong with the money." I told her that was just the tip of the iceberg, that I had discovered something much bigger, something that put every homeowner at risk. "I can't tell you what it is just yet," I said, "but it will be revealed at the meeting. What I need from you is help. Can you think of anyone else who's been pushed around by Karen? Anyone who's fed up?" Martha's lips thinned into a grim line. "Oh, I can think of a few." Over the next week, Martha became my quiet co-conspirator. She made a list. There was the Rodriguez family, a young couple with 2 small kids, who had been fined repeatedly for their children's plastic slide in their backyard, deemed an unapproved permanent structure. There was Mr. Gable, a retired teacher, who was in a constant battle with Karen over the small vegetable patch he kept behind his house. There was a group of at least 5 other families who had been hit with what Martha called drive-by fining, where Karen's designated compliance officer would patrol the neighborhood and issue tickets for the most minor infractions. A garbage can left out an hour too long, a small oil spot on a driveway, a garden hose not perfectly coiled. Each one was a small injustice on its own, a death by 1,000 cuts. But together they formed a clear pattern of abuse and harassment. My job was to connect the dots for them. I approached them carefully, one by one. I didn't lead with the barn or my own fight. I started by asking about their story. I listened to their frustrations. I showed them the respect Karen never had. To the Rodriguez family, I spoke on their driveway one evening. "I heard you've been having some trouble with the HOA over the playset," I began. The husband, a tired-looking man in his 30s, sighed. "It's ridiculous. We get a letter every week. They want us to submit architectural drawings for a slide we bought at Target." I nodded. "It's not about the slide. It's about control." I then showed him a copy of Karen's LLC registration and the HOA budget for landscaping. I explained how their dues were likely going straight into her pocket. His tiredness was replaced by a flash of anger. "Are you serious? She's paying herself with our money?" "I have the documents to prove it," I said. "There's a hearing in 2 weeks. She's trying to take my barn. But it's going to be about a lot more than that. It's going to be about holding her accountable. We need people there." He looked at his wife, who was standing in the doorway, and then back at me. "We'll be there." I had a similar conversation with Mr. Gable, a gentle man who seemed more bewildered than angry by the HOA's war on his tomatoes. When I showed him the evidence of financial misconduct, his bewilderment turned into a quiet, steely resolve. "This is a betrayal of trust," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "A homeowners association is supposed to serve the homeowners, not fleece them." Slowly but surely, our coalition grew. It was a secret rebellion, planned in quiet conversations over fences and on front porches. We started a private email chain, a secure channel to coordinate. We were no longer a collection of isolated victims. We were an organized front. The key was to keep the big secret, the unpermitted pool, under wraps. That was our trump card, and it could only be played once. Our goal for the meeting was simple: to present a unified block of dissent. When Karen presented her case against me, she would be expecting a lone, defeated old man. She would not be expecting to see the faces of a dozen other homeowners she had wronged, all sitting together, all watching her, all waiting. The week before the hearing, Karen escalated her psychological warfare. New signs went up at the entrance to the subdivision. "A compliant community is a beautiful community. Whispering Pines HOA." She sent out a neighborhood-wide email reminding everyone of the upcoming important hearing regarding a serious and persistent community standards violation. She was framing the narrative, painting me as a public enemy. It was a classic tactic of a tin pot dictator. What she didn't know was that for every resident who read her email and nodded along, there were now 2 who read it and forwarded it to our secret email chain with a comment like, "Can you believe the nerve of this woman?" Her attempts to isolate me were backfiring. She was inadvertently rallying my troops. The night before the meeting, I walked out to my barn. The air was cool and crisp. I ran my hand over the rough sawn planks my father had planed by hand. For the first time in months, the cold knot of anger in my stomach had loosened. It had been replaced by a sense of calm determination. This was no longer just about defending my property. It was about liberating an entire neighborhood from a petty tyrant. Tomorrow, Karen Thompson was expecting to preside over an execution. She had no idea she was walking to her own. The community clubhouse was exactly as I'd pictured it: sterile, beige, and smelling faintly of chlorine and air freshener. It was Karen's temple, and tonight was her high mass. Rows of cheap folding chairs faced a long table at the front of the room, where she and the other 2 board members, Janice and Bob, sat like a tribunal. A flimsy little podium stood to one side for speakers. I arrived early with my lawyer, Ben Carter, at my side. I was carrying my war binder, now thicker than ever. Ben carried a slim, elegant leather briefcase that contained only a few files and a laptop. We took seats in the front row, a deliberate move. We weren't going to hide in the back. Within minutes, my allies began to file in. Martha arrived first, giving me a subtle, determined nod. Then the Rodriguez family, who sat right behind me. Mr. Gable came in and took a seat on the aisle. One by one, the dozen or so families we had spoken to arrived and strategically scattered themselves throughout the room, creating an unavoidable presence. Karen, busy arranging her papers and whispering instructions to Janice, at first didn't notice. Her focus was entirely on the performance she was about to give. She was dressed for the part in a severe-looking navy blue pantsuit, her clipboard a permanent extension of her arm. She finally looked up and scanned the room. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes as she registered the larger-than-usual crowd and the specific faces in it. A brief flash of confusion, maybe annoyance, but it was quickly replaced by her default expression of smug command. She likely assumed they were there to witness her triumph, a public spectacle she herself had advertised. She had no idea they were the jury, and they had already reached a verdict. The meeting began precisely at 7 p.m. Karen banged a small gavel on the table with unnecessary force. "This special hearing of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association is now in session," she announced, her voice booming unnaturally in the acoustically poor room. "The sole item on tonight's agenda is the persistent and egregious violation of community standards by the property at 1515 Old Creek Road, owned by Mr. Jack Hayes." She gestured vaguely in my direction without making eye contact. "For over 2 years, the association has attempted to work with Mr. Hayes to resolve the issue of the large, dilapidated, and unapproved agricultural structure on his property. Our good faith efforts have been met with refusal and contempt. Ben leaned over and whispered, "Let her talk. Let her dig the hole." Karen then launched into a 15-minute monologue, a masterclass in propaganda and half-truths. She spoke of her vision for a premier community. She talked about protecting property values and maintaining a cohesive aesthetic. She portrayed my barn, which sat on my private, non-HOA land, as a direct threat to their way of life. She presented blown-up photos of my barn, taken from a telephoto lens from the street, trying to make the weathered wood look like rot. "This eyesore," she said, tapping one of the photos dramatically, "is what stands between us and true community excellence. It is a symbol of defiance against the standards we have all agreed to uphold." A few of her known supporters in the crowd murmured in agreement. My allies remained silent, their faces impassive stone. She then brought up Bylaw 17, Section C, her fictional asset forfeiture clause. She had brought her own lawyer, a nervous-looking man in a rumpled suit who sat at the end of her table. He chimed in on cue, stating that while the measure was unconventional, the board was acting within the spirit of the powers granted to it by the community covenants to protect collective homeowner value. It was the flimsiest legal argument I had ever heard, and I could see Ben suppress a smile. Finally, Karen turned her attention to me. "Mr. Hayes, you have 5 minutes to explain why this board should not proceed with the immediate remediation and forfeiture of this non-compliant structure." The entire room turned to look at me. The trap was set. This was my moment to walk into it. I stood up, walked to the podium, and opened my binder. I spoke calmly and evenly, without a trace of the anger I felt. I didn't argue or insult. I simply stated facts. My name is Jack Hayes. My family has owned this property since 1948. The barn in question was built by my father and me, starting in 1991. It is structurally sound and well-maintained. I held up a copy of my property deed and the original subdivision filing. As this county document clearly states, my 5-acre property, Lot 2B, is explicitly and permanently exempted from the Whispering Pines HOA covenants. This association has no legal jurisdiction over my land, my house, or my barn. I presented copies of the letters I had sent, showing my attempts to clarify this from the very beginning. I concluded, this is not a matter of community standards. It is a matter of a legally recorded property line. You cannot enforce your rules on a property that is not part of your association. I finished in under 4 minutes and sat down. There was a tense silence in the room. I had presented an irrefutable legal fact. Karen, however, was unfazed. She waved her hand dismissively. "We are all aware of the so-called grandfather clause, Mr. Hayes. However, our legal counsel has advised us that the subsequent amendment regarding external threats to community value gives the board the necessary authority to act in this extreme case. Your structure is a blight, and it affects everyone." She looked at her board members. "I call for a vote on the motion to authorize the board to take all necessary steps, including legal action and physical remediation, to assume control of the non-compliant structure at 1515 Old Creek Road." "I second the motion," said Janice, her voice shrill. "All in favor?" Karen said, her own hand shooting into the air. Janice's and Bob's followed immediately. "The motion passes 3-0, Karen declared, a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. "The barn is now under the administrative control of the association. This hearing is a point of order, Madam President." Ben Carter's voice cut through the room like a razor. He stood up, calm and imposing. Every eye swiveled to him. Karen stared at him, her smirk faltering. "And who are you?" she demanded. "I am Benjamin Carter, counsel for Mr. Hayes. And before you adjourn this meeting, I have a few questions for the board regarding a different matter of community safety and fiscal responsibility. A matter I'm certain every homeowner here will want to hear about." The trap was sprung. Karen was standing right on the X, and she had no idea the world was about to fall out from under her. Karen Thompson stared at Ben, her face a confused mask of indignation. "This meeting is about Mr. Hayes' violation," she snapped, her voice tight with annoyance. "Any other business is out of order." "On the contrary," Ben replied, his voice resonating with calm authority. "My questions pertain directly to the board's fitness to govern and its adherence to the very laws and standards you claim to uphold. They are, therefore, directly relevant to the legitimacy of the vote you just took. He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping across the room to include every homeowner. Let's talk about another structure, a much newer one, the community pool. At the mention of the pool, a nervous energy rippled through the room. It was her pride and joy. Karen's posture straightened, a flicker of pride warring with her irritation. Our pool is a state-of-the-art facility, she said defensively, a crowning jewel for our community. I'm sure it is, Ben said smoothly. A project of that scale, $250,000 according to your own financial reports, must have generated a mountain of paperwork. So for the record, could you please tell the homeowners where they can view the county-approved construction permits for the pool? The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the cheap linoleum floor. Karen's face, which had been flushed with victory, began to pale. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Permits? She finally stammered. Of course there were permits. Everything was handled by the contractor. And who was the general contractor, Madam President? Ben pressed, his tone relentlessly polite. Could you provide us with their name and license number? Karen looked desperately toward her lawyer, the rumpled man at the end of the table. He was shuffling through papers, his face slick with a sudden sweat. He clearly had no idea what was happening. That information is in the files, Karen said, her voice losing its booming confidence. We can provide it at a later date. There's no need to wait, Ben said, pulling a single sheet of paper from his briefcase. Because I have here a certified statement from the county records office, dated yesterday. It confirms that no permits for new construction, plumbing, or electrical work were ever applied for or issued for this address during the entire period of the pool's construction. He held the paper up. In the eyes of the law, this beautiful $250,000 pool doesn't exist. A collective gasp went through the room. People started turning to each other, whispering in shock. Martha looked at me and gave a slow, satisfied nod. The Rodriguez family stared at Karen, their faces a perfect picture of dawning fury. This is a lie, Karen shrieked, finding her voice. It's a trick. He's trying to distract from his own violations. It's a public record, Ben countered, his voice cutting through her panic. He then turned his attention back to the homeowners. What this means for all of you, he explained, his voice clear and deliberate, is that the pool was never inspected by the county. Not once. You have no way of knowing if the electrical work around a giant body of water is safe. You have no way of knowing if the structure is sound. And most importantly, he paused for effect, letting the weight of his next words sink in. No insurance company will cover an illegal, unpermitted structure. The multi-million-dollar liability policy you all pay for through your dues, it's worthless when it comes to that pool. If an accident happens, if a child gets hurt, the lawyers won't be coming for the HOA's insurance. They'll be coming for each and every one of you. They'll be coming for your houses. The room exploded. The whispers turned into shouts. Is this true? Someone yelled from the back. You put our families at risk, shouted Mr. Rodriguez, standing up. My kids swim in that pool. Karen was crumbling. Her face had gone from pale to a blotchy, mottled red. She was backed into a corner, and she did what all cornered bullies do. She lashed out. This is ridiculous. This is a personal attack. He's just angry about his stupid barn. But no one was listening to her anymore. The focus of the room had shifted entirely. The barn was a forgotten memory. Their own financial and physical safety was now on the line. Ben let the chaos swell for a moment before raising his hand for quiet. There's more, he said, and the room fell silent again. I also have here the registration for an LLC called Thompson's Premier Landscaping, registered 2 years ago to one Karen Thompson at her home address. He held up a second document. And I have the HOA's financial statements, which show that beginning 2 years ago, the landscaping budget mysteriously tripled, with payments going to an unnamed vendor. Madam President, are you awarding no-bid contracts to yourself? It was a kill shot. The combination of endangering their children and stealing their money was too much. The carefully constructed facade of Karen Thompson, community leader, shattered into a million pieces. All that was left was a grasping, corrupt fraud. Vote her out, someone screamed. Recall! Recall the board! The chant started low at first, then growing louder. Recall! 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 Karen stood frozen, her face a grotesque canvas of shock, rage, and fear. Her two board members, Janice and Bob, looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. Her lawyer had packed his briefcase and was quietly trying to slip out the side door. The hearing she had called to cement her power had become her public execution. She banged her gavel weakly. "This meeting is adjourned," she yelled, but her voice was lost in the roar of the crowd. She gathered her papers with trembling hands and practically fled from the table, pushing her way through the angry homeowners who were now surging toward the front. I just sat there next to Ben and watched it all unfold. I watched the queen flee her castle as the peasants stormed the gates. The war wasn't over, but the decisive battle had just been won. And all it took was the truth, aimed like a weapon. The aftermath of that meeting was swift and brutal. Karen Thompson didn't just lose control, she vanished. She was a ghost in her own neighborhood. Her car stayed in her garage. Her curtains stayed drawn. The daily power walks with her clipboard ceased entirely. The queen had abdicated, retreating into her beige castle. But the angry villagers weren't finished with her. The very next day, an emergency petition to recall the entire board was circulated. It was spearheaded by Martha and the Rodriguez family. Within 48 hours, it had signatures from over 80% of the homeowners. The speed and unity were unprecedented. My role in this part was minimal. The community, now awakened and furious, was perfectly capable of cleaning its own house. While the recall was underway, the official fallout began. Someone, likely multiple people, had called the county code enforcement office. A county inspector, a grim-faced man named Miller, arrived the following Monday. I watched from my porch as he walked the perimeter of the community pool, his own clipboard in hand. He spent over an hour there. The result was a large, bright red sign zip-tied to the gate. "Unsafe structure, do not enter, by order of the county building department." It was a beautiful sight. The jewel of Karen's kingdom was now officially condemned, a monument to her hubris. The pool was drained and the gate was padlocked. The inspector's report, which quickly became public, was even more damning than we had imagined. It cited not only the complete lack of permits, but also identified multiple immediate safety hazards, including improper electrical bonding and a suction drain that was not compliant with federal safety laws. The report concluded that the entire structure was a severe public health and safety risk. The legal hammer came down next. Ben Carter, on my behalf, sent a formal letter to the now panicked HOA, still technically run by Karen, though she was in hiding. The letter stated that any further attempt to claim or interfere with my property would be met with a lawsuit for harassment and damages. It was a warning shot they couldn't ignore. We received a one-sentence response from the HOA's now former lawyer. "The matter is dropped." My barn was safe. An emergency homeowner meeting was held a week later to formalize the recall. Karen didn't show up. Neither did Janice or Bob. They submitted their resignations via email that morning. A new interim board was elected on the spot. The new president was Mr. Gable, the quiet teacher whose tomatoes had been so offensive to Karen. His first act was to propose a motion to formally dissolve Bylaw 17, Section C, and to issue a formal apology to me. The motion passed unanimously to a round of applause. The new board's second act was to hire a forensic accountant. The investigation into the HOA's finances revealed what we suspected and more. Karen had not only awarded the landscaping contract to herself, but she had also used the HOA's credit card for personal expenses, disguised as administrative supplies and community event costs. The total amount of misused funds was estimated to be over $70,000. The findings were turned over to the district attorney's office. Karen Thompson was now facing not just community disgrace, but potential criminal charges for embezzlement. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a month later. The new board, faced with the condemned pool, had two choices: spend an astronomical sum to bring it up to code, or tear it down. They got estimates for both. Bringing it to code, which would involve extensive demolition and rebuilding, was almost as expensive as starting from scratch. Tearing it down was cheaper but would leave a giant hole in the community and its budget. They presented the options to the homeowners. In the end, a special assessment was passed to fund the demolition and fill the hole, turning the area into a simple park. Karen's legacy was literally being buried. One Saturday morning, I was out by my barn, applying a fresh coat of protective sealant to the oak planks. It was a warm day and the work felt good, restorative. Mr. Gable walked over from his house. "Just wanted to thank you again, Jack," he said, looking at the barn. "You woke us all up." "You guys did all the hard work," I replied, wiping my hands on a rag. "People just needed a reason to stand together." "Well, you gave them one," he said. He looked off in the distance, toward the center of the subdivision where a bulldozer was now sitting next to the drained, empty pool. "Funny, isn't it? She tried to tear down this beautiful, historic structure," he said, nodding toward my barn. "And in the end, the only thing getting demolished is her cheap, illegal monstrosity." We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. The sound of birdsong mixed with the distant rumble of machinery. The community was healing. The petty rules were being rolled back. The focus was shifting from punitive enforcement to actual community building. The war was over. I had won. But it wasn't a victory that felt like conquest. It felt like peace. The peace I had wanted all along. I had defended my father's legacy, and in doing so, had helped my neighbors reclaim their own community from the clutches of a petty tyrant. As I finished my work, I looked at my barn, its wood glowing in the afternoon sun, solid and enduring. It was more than just a building. It was a testament to the idea that you build things to last, that you stand your ground, and that sometimes the best way to fight a bully who weaponizes rules is to simply hold them accountable to the ones that truly matter. The quiet satisfaction of that thought was better than any revenge. It was justice, and it was time to get back to enjoying my retirement.